Welcome. This presentation critically examines Tom Griffiths' The Laws of Thought and argues that what he calls laws are better understood as modeling choices, useful but not ontological laws. Over the next set of slides, we'll summarize his claims, expose conceptual weaknesses, and propose a clearer framing that separates substrate, algorithm, and experience. Griffiths sets out a Newtonian ambition for cognitive science to replace messy folk psychology with compact mathematical principles. He frames the mind as a resource-rational engine and proposes a unified algorithmic foundation that spans cognitive science, computer science, and behavioral economics. The claim is bold. Cognition is not a collection of quirks, but an optimized system shaped by strict physical constraints. At the heart of Griffiths' program are three interlocking claims. First, cognition can be modeled by three complementary frameworks: symbolic rules, probabilistic inference, and connectionist networks. Second, human cognition is shaped by severe resource constraints: time, metabolic energy, and communication bandwidth. Third, many apparent biases are actually resource-rational shortcuts that trade accuracy for computational cost. Griffiths emphasizes Bayesian inference as the principled way the mind handles uncertainty. The mind, he argues, maintains priors and updates beliefs when new evidence arrives. The rules and symbols pillar captures compositionality, the capacity to build complex thoughts from finite tokens. Griffiths locates the structural scaffolding for language, grammar, and systematic reasoning here. Griffiths treats neural networks as the mathematical engine of perception: high-dimensional vector spaces, continuous mappings, and iterative weight updates that minimize error. He presents this as a law of continuous geometric optimization, the substrate that implements pattern recognition and representation learning. Resource rationality reframes biases as optimal strategies under cost constraints. Instead of labeling heuristics as failures, Griffiths models them as solutions that maximize expected utility while minimizing computation. The three bottlenecks, limited time, limited energy, and low bandwidth, explain why the brain prefers fast, approximate strategies. Crucially, Griffiths redefines thought at the algorithmic level. Thought becomes the totality of computations that represent, transform, and select, most of which occur unconsciously. Conscious awareness is treated as a low-bandwidth interface, not the locus of thinking itself. These claims invite scrutiny. When we test them against formal theory and empirical data, several tensions appear. The next slides walk through the main contradictions: the mismatch between human heuristics and formal systems, failures of explicit reasoning, and the definitional consequences of expanding thought to include subconscious computation. Modern formal logic and measure-theoretic probability demand strict axioms and consistency. Human heuristics routinely violate those axioms. If Griffiths' pillars are meant to be literal laws, they fail this basic test. The cognitive processes he models are often primitive, approximate, and inconsistent with the rigor of formal systems. Empirical tasks like the Wasson selection task and the gambler's fallacy show systematic failures in explicit reasoning. If formal logic and probability were native laws of thought, such failures would be inexplicable. Instead, they suggest that explicit formal reasoning is culturally scaffolded and not the default mode of human cognition. By expanding thought to include automatic, unconscious processes, Griffiths risks erasing the psychological category that distinguishes conscious reasoning from reflexive computation. A reflex or an automatic motor catch becomes indistinguishable from deliberative planning if all are labeled thought, and that collapse undermines the concept's usefulness. Here we summarize the structural contradictions. The claim that three mathematical pillars constitute laws of thought conflicts with formal requirements, empirical failures in explicit reasoning, and the definitional integrity of thought. Each pillar may be useful as a modeling tool, but together they do not form a coherent, ontological account of conscious thought. This section moves beyond surface-level objections and digs into the structural problems in Griffiths' framework. The vulnerabilities we'll examine are not merely empirical anomalies, they are conceptual. Over the next slides, we unpack four meta-level flaws that together undermine the claim that logic, probability, and neural networks are co-equal laws of thought. Griffiths' theory rests on four interlocking conceptual weaknesses. First, an architectural redundancy. The three pillars collapse into a single computational substrate. Second, a semantic hijack. Formal terms are repurposed to describe ordinary biological capacities. Third, an instrumental fallacy. Descriptive mathematics is mistaken for internal mechanism. Fourth, a historical inversion. cultural inventions are treated as innate biological laws. Each of these moves is defensible in isolation, but together they produce a systematic distortion of what the brain actually is and how it works. Griffiths separates symbolic logic, Bayesian inference, and connectionist networks as distinct pillars. But structurally, there is no principled reason to posit logic and probability outside the neural substrate. A sufficiently complex, high-dimensional network can produce discretization and statistical tracking as emergent states. In other words, what look like separate paradigms in computer science are better understood as different functional modes of one substrate, not independent biological modules. Historically, AI split into three camps: symbolic, Bayesian, and connectionist, because of methodological debates. Biology does not respect those disciplinary boundaries. The brain's single, distributed architecture can instantiate discretization, error minimization, and compositional B. Griffiths' terminology recasts ordinary survival functions in formal language. What he calls logic is often just discretization and categorization, the brain's way of slicing a continuous world into manageable tokens. What he calls Bayesian inference is frequently fast, biased judgment under constraint. This semantic rebranding makes qualitative biological capacities sound like pristine mathematical laws, when in fact they are pragmatic, approximate strategies shaped by evolution. If an apple falls in perfect accord with Newton's equations, we don't infer the apple is secretly doing calculus. The equations are the scientist's description, not the apple's internal process. Likewise, showing that human behavior matches Bayesian distributions demonstrates statistical alignment, not that the brain literally executes Bayesian algorithms. The math is an explanatory instrument, not proof of internal mechanism. Human intuition can align with optimal statistical patterns because evolution and learning tune neural weights to the structure of the environment. That alignment is powerful and informative, but it does not imply that the brain contains explicit Bayesian modules or symbolic engines. Formal logic and probability are cultural technologies, inventions that emerged over millennia to help humans reason beyond our biological limits. Griffiths reverses this historical relationship by treating those cultural monuments as if they were foundational bricks inside our biology. In reality, the brain is an adaptive, associative system that shapes itself to mirror environmental regularities. Mathematics is an external tool we developed to formalize and extend those capacities. We conclude this video by summarizing the findings and discussing the implications of our critique. For cognitive science, the implication is clear. Keep modeling tools and metaphysical claims separate. Use logic and probability as powerful instruments for simulation, but avoid reifying them into biological primitives. Only by preserving levels of explanation can we move from descriptive fit to genuine understanding. There's an important distinction between building functional simulations and offering an explanatory theory of the mind. Griffiths' framework is highly effective for simulating intelligent behavior under resource constraints. But as an explanatory account of why the mind has conscious, reportable thought, it performs a sleight of hand. It rebrands basic sensing and categorization as formal math, splits emergent functions into arbitrary pillars, and mistakes cultural tools for innate wiring. To summarize, the mathematical order Griffiths observes is real, but it reflects the statistical structure of the environment and the adaptive tuning of a single neural substrate, not independent, ontological laws of thought. This video provides supplementary notes to explore explanatory errors and foundational principles in cognitive science. This diagnostic blueprint for cognitive modeling deconstructs explanatory errors and foundational principles in cognitive science based on the Griffiths critique. The first area we'll examine is fallacies, focusing on the breaks in logic that undermine theoretical clarity. This slide explains the false analogy problem. Griffiths and others sometimes present heuristic trends or heuristic-style laws as if they were the same kind of universal predictive rule as Moore's law. The article points out that this is a category mistake. Moore's law describes a single measurable engineering variable with decades of empirical regularity. Heuristic scaling claims in cognition attempt to import that aura of universality without comparable structure or predictive power. The result is rhetorical authority without the empirical backbone, an appearance of lawfulness that collapses under scrutiny. Here we unpack the confusion between a model that fits behavior and a mechanism that produces it. The article uses the apple and Newton analogy. An apple's fall matches Newtonian equations, but the apple is not doing calculus. Likewise, showing that human judgments align with Bayesian curves proves statistical alignment, not that the brain literally runs Bayesian arithmetic. This slide emphasizes the epistemic cost. Reifying a fit as a mechanism blocks exploration of alternative implementations that could produce the same observable behavior. This slide shows how collapsing explanatory tiers creates conceptual chaos. Griffiths lists neural networks, logic, and probability as co-equal pillars. The article argues that these belong to different explanatory levels: implementational substrate, algorithmic procedure, and formal calculus. And treating them as the same kind of thing produces equivocation. When you mix hardware and abstract formalisms in one taxonomy, you lose clarity about what is being explained and at which level experiments should be targeted. This slide explains equivocation, shifting the meaning of a key term mid-argument. The article documents how thought is used in two incompatible senses: the everyday, conscious, reportable sense, and a broad computational sense that includes unconscious processing. By sliding between these meanings, a theory can claim to explain thought in full while only modeling background computation. The slide stresses the practical harm. Equivocation conceals real disagreements about consciousness and lets a model appear more comprehensive than it is. This slide addresses the rhetorical move of borrowing prestige. Griffiths deliberately echoes Boole's laws of thought to confer historical legitimacy. The article calls this out as an appeal to authority. Invoking Boole's title lends normative weight to a descriptive, resource-bounded account. The danger is that historical association can distract from conceptual mismatches. It persuades by pedigree, rather than by showing that the modern framework actually satisfies Boole's original normative aims. This slide covers reification, treating abstract model elements as literal brain objects. The article highlights how terms like Bayesian priors are sometimes spoken of as if they were physical entities in the brain rather than useful explanatory constructs. Reification closes down inquiry. If priors are assumed to be concrete objects, researchers may stop asking how those priors could be implemented, measured, or falsified, and prematurely attribute ontological status to a modeling convenience. This slide explains hasty generalization. The article points to classic experimental paradigms: the Wasson selection task, Gambler's fallacy studies, and warns against extrapolating from a few narrow tasks to universal cognitive laws. When researchers generalize too quickly, they produce overconfident theories that fail outside the original testbeds. The slide urges methodological humility. Broad claims require broad, diverse evidence. This slide describes the false dichotomy error. Historically, AI debates framed cognition as either symbolic logic or connectionism. The article shows that this binary is misleading. Hybrid and emergent architectures exist, and modern neural systems can instantiate behaviors that look symbolic or probabilistic without separate modules. Presenting only two exhaustive options, narrows theoretical imagination and obscures architectures that combine or transcend the old categories. Finally, we examine key concepts and essential terminology. This slide lays out the three essential tiers we must keep separate: implementational, algorithmic, and phenomenal. The article repeatedly warns that Griffiths collapses these tiers by treating substrate facts, modeling languages, and subjective experience as if they were the same kind of explanation. Listen for the practical test. When a claim is made about how the mind works, ask whether it names neurons and circuits, an algorithmic procedure, or the felt quality of thought, and demand the argument show how one level maps to the others rather than smuggling them together. Here we contrast resource limits with physical mechanisms. The article accepts resource rationality as a powerful account of why heuristics exist. Time, energy, and bandwidth shape strategy, but stresses that these constraints are algorithmic pressures, not physical explanations. In other words, knowing that a shortcut is adaptive under cost constraints does not tell you how the brain implements that shortcut. It only tells you why selection favored it. Keep that distinction in mind when a model claims normative optimality and then leaps to mechanistic conclusions. This slide explains two linked problems: emergence and the misuse of technical language. The article argues that behaviors labeled logic or Bayesian inference often emerge from distributed network dynamics rather than from separate symbolic or probabilistic modules. At the same time, prestigious terms are sometimes repurposed to make these emergent behaviors sound like literal instantiations of formal systems. The result is a rhetorical boost for descriptive models that can obscure the fact that the underlying substrate may be doing something quite different. This slide moves from what the brain is to what it feels like to be a mind. The critique emphasizes that substrate facts, neurons wired into networks, are necessary, but not sufficient to explain conscious, reportable thought. The article proposes focusing on candidate sufficiency conditions, integrated memory, symbolic scaffolding, and recursive self-monitoring as the structural features that could plausibly bridge computation and experience. Use these conditions as a checklist. Does a model merely simulate behavior, or does it provide mechanisms that could produce the phenomenology of thought? This slide warns against seductive but misleading metaphors. The article calls out the tendency to borrow the rhetorical power of engineering laws. For example, comparing cognitive trends to Moore's law without matching the empirical rigor those laws require. False analogies create an illusion of universality and predictability that can distort research priorities and policy decisions. When you hear a claim framed as a law, demand the same kinds of single-variable regularity, falsifiable forecasts, and long-run empirical support that justify calling something a law in engineering. The methodological defense framework pairs logical fallacies with foundational concepts, such as addressing the false analogy with implementational triviality. Rigorous modeling requires explicit distinction between mathematical descriptions, physical mechanisms, and subjective phenomena.